The sky was a monochrome canvas of obsidian, stippled with crimson. The air hung heavy with the scent of ozone and burning flesh. The once pristine cityscape was reduced to rubble, the ground littered with twisted metal and shattered glass. The aliens, known only as the Swarm, had come in droves, their insectal bodies an unsettling blend of organic and mechanical. They moved with a relentless efficiency, their razor-sharp mandibles clicking menacingly as they scoured the ruins for any remaining signs of resistance. Megan Klein huddled in the crater, her body trembling from both cold and fear. Her once promising career as a xenolinguist had been reduced to this, a desperate struggle for survival among the ruins of her world. But even now, as the aliens searched for stragglers, she couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. The Swarm's language was complex and unfamiliar, but it was also full of secrets. Secrets that, if she could unlock them, might just save humanity. As if in answer to her unspoken plea, a sharp crack echoed through the air. A figure stumbled into view, clutching its chest where a glittering shard of shrapnel protruded. Megan's heart leapt into her throat. It was Captain John Ramirez, the leader of the human resistance. His face was grim, his eyes hard with determination. He surveyed the carnage around them, then turned to Megan, his voice barely above a whisper. "We have to get out of here." Megan nodded, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Together they began to crawl through the rubble, using what remained of the buildings for cover. As they moved, Megan couldn't shake the feeling that there was something different about this attack. The Swarm's usual tactics involved swarming their targets and overwhelming them with sheer numbers. But this time, there seemed to be fewer of them, and they were fighting more methodically, as if searching for something specific. Something that could change the course of the war. The air grew colder as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in shadow. The sounds of gunfire and explosions grew distant, replaced by the soft rustling of the aliens as they continued their search. Megan and Ramirez pressed themselves against the crumbling wall, their backs against the cold, unforgiving concrete. They were both exhausted, their bodies aching from the exertion of the battle and the hours of hiding since. Megan glanced at Captain Ramirez, his face etched with determination and weariness. She knew he was thinking the same thing she was. They had to find out what the Swarm were looking for. But the thought of confronting them terrified her. She couldn't speak their language, not well enough to understand what they were saying or why they were here. "Megan," Captain Ramirez whispered, his breath fogging the air between them. "You have to understand. If we don't find whatever it is they're after, we're all doomed." His words hung in the air like a weight, pressing down on her shoulders. Megan swallowed hard, trying to find the courage to speak. "I know," she said finally. "But we can't just let them take it. Not without a fight." She looked up at him, her brown eyes pleading with him to trust her. "I can help you. I can understand their language." Captain Ramirez studied her for a long moment before nodding. "All right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll need all the help we can get. But you have to promise me one thing." "What's that?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "You promise me that you'll stay alive. Because if you die, we both die. Do you understand?" Megan nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. She knew he was right. They needed her translation skills, but she was no soldier. She could barely even hold a gun without trembling. And yet, somehow, she found the strength to nod again, more confidently this time. Together, they crept through the ruins, avoiding the aliens as best they could. Megan kept her eyes and ears peeled, trying to make sense of the Swarm's language. She knew they were searching for something important, but she wasn't sure what it was. She wished she could understand their conversations, their commands. It was the key to stopping them. Hours passed, and the sun began to rise, casting a pale, cold light over the devastated city. They had managed to avoid detection so far, but Megan could feel the tension in Captain Ramirez's shoulders, the way he clutched his weapon a little too tightly. She knew he was itching for a fight, but she also knew that they couldn't afford to make a mistake. The fate of humanity depended on them. Finally, they spotted a group of aliens huddled around what appeared to be a large metal object buried in the rubble. Megan's heart skipped a beat as she realized what it must be. The swarm had been searching for the remains of a human communications array, hidden away by the resistance months ago. It was their last hope of contacting the outside world, of rallying support against the invaders. Captain Ramirez nodded to her, silently asking if she understood. She nodded back, her eyes burning with determination. They would not let the swarm take it. They would fight to the death if they had to. Slowly, they crept closer, weaving through the debris and avoiding the aliens' gazes. Megan gripped her weapon tightly, her heart hammering in her chest. She glanced at Captain Ramirez, his face a mask of concentration. They had to be careful, methodical. One wrong move could cost them everything. Finally, they were close enough. Captain Ramirez gestured to her, signaling that it was her turn. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to do. She raised her weapon, aimed it at the lead swarm, and fired. The alien screamed, its body jerking as the bullets tore through it. The others whirled around, their weapons raised in defense. Megan kept firing, her shots landing true, dropping the aliens one by one. Captain Ramirez joined her, his gunfire echoing through the ruins. The swarm fought back, but they were no match for the two of them. Finally, the last of the aliens lay still. Megan lowered her weapon, her heart racing, but a sense of triumph burning bright inside her. They had done it. They had saved the human race. She looked at Captain Ramirez, and knew they had to keep moving. They still had to find a way to activate the communications array and send out a distress signal. Together, they approached the object buried in the rubble. Megan's hands trembled as she brushed aside debris, revealing the array beneath. She glanced at Captain Ramirez, who nodded encouragingly. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders, and began to work. Hours passed as she struggled to activate the array, her fingers moving over the controls with a practiced ease that belied her lack of training. Finally, with a triumphant cry, the array sprang to life, its antennae extending outward, seeking a signal. Captain Ramirez embraced her, his eyes shining with tears. They had done it. They had saved humanity. But even as they celebrated their victory, they knew the fight wasn't over yet. The swarm would surely send reinforcements, and they would have to be ready to defend themselves against whatever came their way. As the sun shone on the ruined city, they stood side by side, their shoulders barely touching, ready for whatever the future might hold. As they were standing there, a small group of survivors joined them. Captain Ramirez looked at Megan, his eyes filled with admiration and gratitude. He knew that without her quick thinking and unwavering courage, they would have never made it this far. And yet, he couldn't help but wonder what the future held for them. The war was far from over, and the road ahead was fraught with danger. Megan, too, felt a mixture of pride and trepidation. She had never expected to find herself in such a position of leadership, but she knew that she had to be strong for the others. She couldn't afford to let her doubts and fears get the better of her. She took a deep breath and squared her shoulders, determined to lead them to victory, no matter the cost. As the night fell, they huddled around a small fire, sharing what little food and water they had. They talked in hushed whispers about their families, their homes, and the lives they had left behind. Some of them cried, unable to contain their grief any longer. Others clung to the hope that they would survive this war and one day return to a world that wasn't defined by death and destruction. Captain Ramirez rose, signaling for everyone's attention. "Listen," he said, his voice steady despite the weariness in his eyes. "We may not know what the future holds, but we do know this: we are stronger together. We will face this enemy, and we will emerge victorious. For now, let us rest. Tomorrow, we continue our fight." With that, they settled down to sleep, their weary bodies pressed close together for warmth and comfort. Megan lay awake for a while, staring up at the stars, wondering if they would ever see their homes again. But even as she felt the weight of their situation, she couldn't help but feel a spark of hope, a spark that had been kindled the day she had met Captain Ramirez, and had only grown brighter since. As dawn broke, they rose, stretching stiff limbs and sharing out what little food remained. Captain Ramirez gathered them around, his face grim but determined. "All right, soldiers," he said, using the word with a newfound pride. "Today, we scout the perimeter, look for supplies, and prepare for what's to come. We cannot afford to be complacent. The swarm will be back, and we must be ready." Megan nodded in agreement, her eyes meeting his. They had become a team, a family, in the face of adversity. She trusted Captain Ramirez with her life, and she knew that he felt the same way about her. Together, they would see this through, no matter the cost. Throughout the day, they worked tirelessly, scouring the ruined city for supplies and information. They found an abandoned research facility, its halls littered with the remains of scientists and their work. They gathered as much data as they could, but they knew that they had to keep moving, that they could not afford to get caught in another ambush. As night fell once more, they huddled around another fire, sharing stories of home and loved ones, of lives that had been lost and dreams that had been shattered. Megan found herself drawn to Captain Ramirez, the strength and resilience she saw in him a beacon of hope in the darkness. She wondered what kind of life they might have together, if there was even a future for them beyond the war. Captain Ramirez seemed to sense her thoughts, and he turned to her, his eyes serious. "Megan," he began, "I want you to know that whatever happens, you are not alone. I will always be here for you, to protect you and fight by your side. And when this is all over, I want to be the man you deserve." His words sent a shiver down her spine, and she knew that she felt the same way about him. They sat in silence for a while, lost in their own thoughts, until finally, Captain Ramirez stood and stretched, his muscles protesting from a day of hard labor. "All right," he said, his voice firm. "Let's get some rest. Tomorrow, we move out, and we don't stop until we've found a way to end this war." Together, they lay down on makeshift bedding, their bodies pressed close as they sought warmth against the cold night air. Captain Ramirez wrapped his arm around Megan, pulling her close, his hand resting protectively on her hip. She felt safe and protected in his embrace, and as she drifted off to sleep, she couldn't help but imagine a future where they were together, where they could build a life free from the threat of the swarm. Megan knew that, come tomorrow, they would leave the other survivors behind, and strike out on their own. The thought was both exhilarating and frightening, since they didn't know what the journey would bring. As the hours passed, the image of that future began to fade, replaced by the harsh reality of their situation. They were still on the run, still one step behind the swarm, and every time they thought they had found a safe haven, it was taken from them. They could only hope that they would find a way to turn the tide, to find a weakness in the seemingly endless horde of insects that sought to destroy everything they held dear. With the first light of dawn, they awoke stiff and sore from the hard ground. Captain Ramirez rose first, quietly slipping out of bed and gathering their meager supplies. Megan followed suit, her movements equally silent and efficient. They didn't need to speak, they had been working together so long now that they moved as one. As they prepared to leave, Captain Ramirez paused, looking out over the ruined cityscape with a mixture of determination and sorrow. "We'll find a way to stop them, Megan," he said, his voice firm. "I promise you that. We'll find a way." She nodded, her eyes meeting his, and together they stepped out into the dawn, ready to face whatever challenges the day might bring. Their journey took them deeper into the city, further from the safety of the last outpost they had called home. They scavenged what they could from abandoned buildings, but the signs of the swarm's advance were unmistakable. Buildings reduced to rubble, insect carapaces scattered across the ground, the stench of death and decay hanging heavy in the air. As the day wore on, they grew more and more cautious, alert to the slightest sound or movement. They knew that at any moment, they could be ambushed by the relentless horde. Captain Ramirez stopped abruptly, holding up a hand to signal for silence. Megan froze, her heart hammering in her chest. After a tense moment, she heard it too, the distant buzz of thousands of insect wings. The swarm was near. They ducked behind a pile of rubble, their breath coming in ragged gasps as they tried to control their fear. "We have to find a way to slow them down," Captain Ramirez whispered, his voice strained. "By ourselves sometime." Megan nodded, her eyes darting about as she searched for some sort of weapon or device that might help them in their desperate struggle. As the sound of the swarm grew louder, she spotted something glinting in the sunlight. "Captain?" she hissed. "Over there!" Captain Ramirez followed her gaze and saw what she was pointing at, an abandoned jeep, its hood dented and covered in insect carapaces. There was a crate sitting in the back, and as they approached, they could see that it was full of grenades. "All right," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. "We'll use these to our advantage." Together, they carefully removed the grenades from the crate, checking each one to make sure it was still functional. Captain Ramirez pulled out a handful of pins, making them ready to throw. "We'll need to be precise," he warned. "One shot and we can take out a good number of them. But we can't waste any." They waited until they could see the leading edge of the swarm, a surging mass of insects that seemed to block out the sun. Captain Ramirez took a deep breath, then threw the first grenade, aiming for the center of the swarm. The explosion was deafening, throwing insect carapaces and shards of insect armor through the air. "Now!" Captain Ramirez shouted as he threw the rest of the grenades into the swarm. Megan followed suit, lobbing her grenades into the mass of insects as they surged toward them. There were screams of pain and confusion as the explosions rocked the ground, sending insect bodies flying through the air. They took advantage of the brief respite to retreat further into the building they had been hiding behind. Captain Ramirez slumped against the wall, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. "Not bad," he managed to gasp out. "But they'll be back. We need to find a better place to make our stand." Megan nodded, her eyes darting around the room. "There's a basement here," she said, pointing to a door in the corner. "It might offer some protection." She hesitated for a moment, then added, "And we might be able to find more supplies down there." Captain Ramirez nodded, feeling a spark of hope ignite in his chest. "Let's do it," he said, pushing himself off the wall. "We can't keep running forever. It's time to make a stand." Together, they made their way to the basement, carefully feeling their way down the dark, musty stairs. The air grew cooler and damper as they descended deeper into the earth. As they reached the bottom, they found a cramped storage room filled with boxes and crates. "Over here," Megan whispered, leading Captain Ramirez to a corner where a few crates had been piled up. She began to rummage through them, her fingers moving quickly as she searched for anything that might be useful. "Captain," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "Look at this!" Captain Ramirez joined her, squinting in the dim light as she showed him a crate filled with what appeared to be weapons, makeshift spears, bows, and even a few homemade explosives. "Megan," he breathed, "I think we just found our ticket out of here." The two of them set to work immediately, loading the weapons and preparing as many explosives as they could. Captain Ramirez practiced with the bow, his movements growing more confident with each arrow he notched. Megan, on the other hand, honed her skills with the spear, throwing it time and again against a nearby crate until she was sure of its accuracy. As they worked, they heard the sounds of the swarm growing closer again. This time, however, they were better prepared. They left the basement, armed to the teeth, and took up residence in a narrow alleyway, which would force the swarm to enter in a single file. Captain Ramirez loaded his explosives, taking aim at a strategic spot where he knew the swarm would funnel in. Megan readied her spear, ready to take out any insects that might get too close. The swarm attacked once more, but this time they were met with a fierce resistance. Captain Ramirez detonated his explosives, sending a wave of destruction through the swarm. Megan took aim at the survivors, picking them off one by one with her spear. The air was thick with the stench of burning insect flesh and the screams of pain, but they fought on. Hour after hour they held their ground, their makeshift weapons proving surprisingly effective against the swarm. As the sun began to set, they could see that the tide of the battle was turning in their favor. The swarm grew more disorganized and desperate, and they were beginning to lose their numbers. Captain Ramirez looked at Megan, his eyes gleaming with determination. "We can do this," he said, his voice firm. "We can win this war." She nodded, her chest heaving as she fought for breath from the exertion of battle. "You're right," she agreed. But we can't let our guard down yet. We still have a long fight ahead of us. Together, they continued to fight, their weapons singing through the air as they fought for their lives and the lives of their people. Captain Ramirez had never felt more alive, more in control, than he did in this moment. There was a fierce determination burning within him, a will to survive that was stronger than anything he had ever known. Megan, on the other hand, was growing weary. Her arms ached from the strain of wielding her makeshift spear, her shoulders and back screaming in protest against the constant tension of holding her spear. But she wouldn't give up. She couldn't. The thought of returning to the horrors that awaited them above was enough to keep her fighting until the very end. The sun set, and darkness descended upon the world. The swarm continued to attack, but now they were less organized, less coordinated. They stumbled and fell in the darkness, their exoskeletons glowing like embers in the night. Captain Ramirez and Megan took advantage of this, using the shadows to their advantage as they picked off the survivors one by one. Hours passed, and the sounds of the swarm began to fade. The two of them stood in the silence, their backs to each other, their weapons lowered. They were exhausted, battered, and bloodied, but they were alive. They had won. Captain Ramirez turned to Megan, his eyes shining with tears. "We did it," he whispered. "We actually did it." She nodded, unable to speak as she wiped the sweat and tears from her face. "Yes," she managed to choke out. "We did." They stood together for a moment longer, basking in the glow of their victory, before realizing that there was still work to be done. They had to find a way to reach the survivors, to alert the rest of the world to the danger that still lurked beneath them. With renewed determination, they set about searching the storage room where they had found their weapons for anything that might help them. Captain Ramirez paused for a moment, taking in the familiar sights and sounds before turning to Megan. "We have to find a way to alert the others," he said, his voice urgent. "We can't let what happened here happen to them." She nodded, her eyes scanning the horizon as she considered their options. Together, they made their way through the forest of buildings. Suddenly, a flicker of light caught Megan's eye. In the distance, a lone building stood defiant against the encroaching darkness. Smoke curled from its chimney, a beacon of hope in the desolate landscape. As they approached, they could hear the faint sounds of voices. Humans. Relief flooded Megan, washing away the exhaustion and fear that had gripped her for so long. They weren't alone. With newfound energy, they hurried towards the building, their footsteps echoing in the night. The door creaked open as they approached, revealing a group of survivors huddled around a crackling fire. Megan and Captain Ramirez stepped inside, their battered figures causing the room to fall silent. For a moment, the survivors stared at them in disbelief. Then, a woman rushed forward, her eyes wide with recognition. "Megan? Captain Ramirez? Is it really you?" Megan smiled, tears welling up in her eyes. "It's us," she confirmed. "We made it." The room erupted in cheers and cries of relief. Megan and Captain Ramirez, the symbols of resistance they never intended to be, were embraced by their people. Later, as the fire crackled and stories were shared, Megan explained the horrors they had witnessed, the relentless onslaught of the swarm, and the desperate struggle they had fought for survival. But she also spoke of hope, of the makeshift weapons they had discovered and the strategic stand they had made. A spark of determination ignited within the group. They wouldn't just survive, they would fight back. Megan, exhausted but resolute, offered her expertise in deciphering the swarm's language, a key to understanding their tactics and weaknesses. Captain Ramirez, his leadership honed in the crucible of battle, began training the survivors, teaching them how to use the weapons they had found. Megan, once a ridiculed linguist, became a beacon of hope, a vital cog in the resistance machine. As the sun peeked over the horizon, casting its golden light on the faces of the determined survivors, Megan knew their fight was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of optimism. They were no longer just scattered individuals, but a united front, ready to face the swarm and reclaim their world. The embers of hope had been rekindled, and Megan, the once ostracized scientist, stood at the heart of the flame. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories, give us a like if you want to see more, and drop a comment below to let us know your thoughts.